I'm the founder of a company called American Giant, and we are a clothing company that makes all of our clothes entirely in the United States and sell through exclusively our website, no stores. And I think I'm probably the only speaker at the Zeitgeist conference this year actually speaking about thread. And I'm going to take you through. I'm going to take you through a little bit of the process that we went through making I think the product we're best known for, which is a hoodie that has been called the Greatest Hoodie Ever Made. And I'm going to take you through that journey that we went down that for me was a very inspiring and sort of caused me to, I think, rethink a lot of the fundamental assumptions I'd made about manufacturing and the impact of manufacturing. More broadly about beginning to rethink the apparel industry as a whole, maybe what was wrong with the apparel industry as a whole, and stimulated some questions about maybe even America itself. To learn a little bit about American Giant, it might help to know a little bit about me. That's me in the middle. I grew up in the 70s, the youngest of 3 boys, raised by a single mom. And in addition to being a fanatical Boston Bruins fan, oh, wow, excellent. I grew up in the 70s in a time when the great American brands were sort of thriving, alive and well. I remember clearly wearing Levi's for the first time and being struck that, oh, I'm a Levi's guy. I'm not a corduroy guy. Probably the most impactful for me was actually a sweatshirt that my mom bought for me at the local Caldors. She could afford it. I still have it. Lasted forever. Got better and better with age. Made entirely in the United States. That type of garment doesn't exist anymore today. But it made an impression on me that I think probably stuck with me through my career that made me want to get into, I think, some kind of activity that would give me the opportunity to do something special with an American brand and American manufacturing. And after a brief foray into corporate finance in New York, I turned pretty quickly to apparel and footwear and spent my career doing that predominantly. For those of you that have spent any time around the apparel industry, what you realize really quickly is that the fundamental dynamics have shifted there, that those businesses really have become about supporting very big, very expensive, very complex distribution in the form of stores and malls all across the country, and big marketing programs to drive traffic into those stores. That's often paid for, in my view, by a slow but steady whittling away of quality, manufacturing moving offshore, brand values beginning to become maybe more wobbly than they used to be when we were younger. An interesting thing began to happen 10 years ago or so. I think consumers began to sort of become subconsciously, consciously aware of this idea that quality was not as present. This is my interpretation anyway. And that you began to see consumers saying more and more, hey, quality is something that I'm missing. Quality product, manufacturing stories, transparency about who the people were that were making things. Wanting to get closer to that, wanting to have a relationship with the products they were consuming, the people that were making those products. But the market dynamics were such that was getting solved for in ways that really looked more like boutiques in Brooklyn selling $300 pairs of jeans, relegating that interaction with product to the elite consumer. San Francisco and Brooklyn, not mainstream America. I was really interested in solving for the mainstream problem. I believed it was a universal desire, one that was not relegated to people that were living in San Francisco, but that the marketplace wasn't solving for it very well. And I had the desire to do something big and at scale, of the size of a Gap, not of the size of a boutique in a wealthy city. But always, I think, sort of began to believe that was sort of the dynamics had shifted enough that was no longer possible. But a funny thing began to happen about 4 or 5 years ago. The change that we're all familiar with about consumer behavior beginning to rethink the book industry and the video industry and the music industry, little by little began to impact the suburban mall and other industries like apparel in our view. And slowly but surely, you had consumers saying, at least as we interpret it, I don't care so much about the store experience. I don't care very much about the suburban mall. I care a lot about quality. I care a lot about value. I care a lot about brand values. And equally importantly, from where I sat, there was a desire or a change in behavior that the great brands that were emerging today were being discovered, loyalty was being generated from word-of-mouth communication, friends telling friends, social networks, not big, unwieldy marketing budgets that looked like billboards in Times Square or full-page print ads. So here I was saying, wow, consumers are saying quality matters, brand values matter, US manufacturing matters, stores don't, marketing budgets don't. That was a aha moment for me, and a moment that gave me enough confidence to say, well, wait a second, what if we did that? What if we put all of our energy into what we believe our customers are asking for and had the courage to abandon the things that are costing so much money and the customers don't want anymore? That was the beginning of the idea of American Giant. For us, for me, I was obsessed with this idea of the sweatshirt. I felt it was the other great American silhouette other than the blue jean. And unlike the blue jean, which had been perfected and refined with many great brands sort of thinking about that and doing an interesting job there, the sweatshirt had really gone the opposite direction. Nothing special, a product that had been relegated to something that you wore to do laundry on a Sunday. And I wanted to think about maybe using that as an opportunity to do something different and special in manufacturing that said, we are going to go look at that in a new way, in a way that says, release yourself from the constraints of having to pay for this unwieldy business as it is today, and focus purely on making something really special, unencumbered by the traditional constraints in the apparel manufacturing world. For us, that began with cotton. We think that sweatshirts, the great sweatshirts, are 100% cotton, not blends, not synthetics. We're lucky enough to live in a part of the world that grows, or live in a country that grows some of the best cotton in the world. All of ours comes from southeastern grown and delta grown cotton. And that fabric works its way up through the harvesters and the ginners and the sorters, up through, in our case, a primarily southeastern-based supply chain, the yarners, in this case, Parkdale Mills in South Carolina, that turns all of our cotton into yarn that results that gets knitted into actual fabric. The dyers and the finishers, we were obsessed with not only the weight and the weave, but also the way the fabric felt. I remember as a child, that dry hand feel that you feel in cotton, backed by a soft, napped back. You're seeing a napping machine on your right here that actually picks the back of the cotton to give it that loft. That process was about an 8-month process of, interestingly enough, almost having to reverse engineer the development of the fabric itself. Many of those old looms had been shipped overseas many years ago. Hardware, and doing the same approach with hardware, thinking about custom hardware versus stock hardware, metal hardware versus plastic, but sort of at a very elemental level, beginning to ask, what makes this product great? What's going to make it differentiated? What's going to make it feel correctly, operate correctly? Fit is an interesting thing. Fit is something that, particularly in the sweatshirt category, had really gone away. Fit's complicated, fit's expensive. You need to have good engineers around the problem that think about how do you make a garment fit you correctly. It requires additional construction work, needlework that oftentimes the industry has said no to in an effort to drive high initial margins on a product. Additional paneling. We sort of set that free and said we want to make a garment that actually looks good, that you could wear into the office, that you'd wear out of the house and be proud to see the in-laws with. A garment that gives you shoulders and gives you a waist. Fit was something we spent a lot of energy on. And then finally, as you move up that chain, the cutting and the sewing process. In our case, all of our material is cut by hand. You're looking at some footage here in a facility in Wendell, North Carolina, where those layers and layers and layers of sweatshirt fabric are getting hand cut. And then moving along into the construction phase, the sewing phase. Easy to forget that 25 years ago, about 95% of the apparel that was consumed in the United States was made in the United States. That ratio has almost flipped entirely now. It's almost 95% made overseas. And yet, in the Carolinas particularly, there is an incredible amount of talent and assets and resources that are underutilized. We were lucky enough to begin to work with a lot of those sewers and operators down there to help us bring to market what, in our view, was something pretty special, something that I was very, very passionate about, inspired by, And it was expensive. It was a garment that we'd spent a lot of time, a lot of energy in. We were making it entirely in the United States. We wanted to price it at a price that made sense for the mainstream consumer. But we were able to do that because we'd given up on stores and given up on marketing. That was the idea anyway. And in February of 2012, we began to ship the product on the hope that if we began to get product out in the marketplace, customers would talk. Friends would tell friends about it. People would begin to buy it for family members, for other friends, talk about it on social networks. That began to happen. Probably easier to see in retrospect than it was at the time, but we began to see consumers coming back, talking about it, posting about it, buying it for their extended networks. And then 10 months after we started to launch the business, Slate magazine wrote an article about us that called us the greatest hoodie ever made. I remember that day clearly. The article came out, I actually didn't think very much of it, and about 4 hours later, we were getting absolutely inundated by orders. And that was a great moment. It not only meant that we suddenly had a great Christmas on our hands, and we were going to sell an awful lot of product, but maybe equally importantly, it kicked off a conversation in the media more broadly about, is American manufacturing viable? Is this hoodie as good as he says it is? What is e-commerce doing to apparel, and might that change be coming that swamped previous industries to this industry? And that elevated the brand. It got awareness that we could have only dreamed of a couple of weeks earlier, and we found ourselves in a different situation than we were a month earlier. We were now going from a tiny little startup in San Francisco into a scrambling business, hiring temp workers as fast as we could. I'm embarrassed to say, shipping in boxes that we were buying at the local Office Depot because we didn't have enough boxes to ship the product in. And off we went. And that kicked off a process that has gone on now for 2.5 years for the business, where we have been flat out trying to meet demand for the product. It's an interesting challenge with the manufacturing business. I think many people in the room here are aware of and familiar with what happens when a technology company gets press, gets awareness, needs to scale quickly. That may look like downloading, 100,000 people find out about an app, 100,000 copies of the app get downloaded. We had a different challenge. Hundreds of thousands of people found out about our product. We had to go make hundreds of thousands of products. And that is an interesting experience. We went from a partial production line in a factory in Brisbane, California, to another factory in Southern California, to a third and a fourth and a fifth in North Carolina, trying to run as fast as we could to scale up production. That's a great thing. It's fun to be a part of a business that's going through that moment. It also had this sort of ancillary benefit that suddenly we were impacting factories that had been idle or close to idle for many, many years. We were hiring in places that had not seen hiring in a long time. It wasn't just the sewers. It was also the people that were behind the supply chain. That's Jerry Hamill on the far left, one of our key cotton growers, and his team of people that harvest and bring their cotton to market. He's a North Carolina-based cotton farmer, and like many of these examples, he is one of these sort of generational businesses that have been around for a long time in the apparel trade. The ginning and the yarning facilities, Parkdale Mills, in this case in Gaffney, South Carolina. Interestingly enough, one of the most modern, maybe the most modern yarning facility in the world, in a tiny town that you might all know from the Peachoid from the Netflix political series. That town actually has one of the most modern yarning facilities in the world in it. To the yarners and impacting the yarners. And up through the chain to Carolina Cotton Works, our dyers and finishers, owned by the Ashby family, third generation family that has been knitting, dyeing, and finishing fabric. We're now the largest customer of CCW. And all along the way, we found ourselves not only impacting the front end of the production line, but the layers and layers of people down the supply chain. And that, when you've spent your career in manufacturing and you spent your career in, at least in my case, being removed almost arm's length from your manufacturing process, when you suddenly found yourself diving deep down into that supply chain, for me it was a pretty profound experience and got me to rethink what it means when you build a product, what consumers value in making a product. In towns like Middlesex, North Carolina, which is about 20 miles outside of Raleigh in Nash County, When we first arrived in Middlesex in 2012 or 2013, unemployment was north of 13%. It is a town that looks very much like other towns around Raleigh. Lots and lots of old vacant warehouses that now suddenly were, it's funny, I remember clearly going into this facility for the first time, and it was just filled with parking spaces. I pulled right up in front, went inside, met the line supervisors. Today, if you go to that facility, there's no room left in the parking lot. They've actually moved into a field next door, and the parking lot is overflowing there. That's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing that we really set out about to do with a fairly narrow goal. We sort of looked at this thing and said, we want to do, consumers are driving something interesting. They are saying, in industry after industry, pay attention to the things that matter to us. Pay attention to the quality, pay attention to the value, pay attention to the brand values. Don't invest in anything else. That simple idea for us took us both down a path of a manufacturing process that was fascinating to me and was interesting and had us impact a whole bunch of interesting layers of the supply chain, but more broadly got me to begin to think about what changes in front of us as technology begins to move into not just software and businesses that maybe are more digitally scalable, but into old world manufacturing businesses. What does that open up for the consumer and their ability to have an impact on the kind of change or businesses that they want to support? I think that in all of you, if you have a badge on your in your Google Zeitgeist badge, in there is a sort of archaic note about a special gift at the concierge desk. It's a sweatshirt for all of you. Hope you go pick it up. When you when you get it, I hope you look at it, you like the sweatshirt, hope it fits you correctly, hope you got the size right, all that sort of stuff. But equally importantly, I hope it stimulates some thinking about what the next wave of change is going to look like on the heels of technology, and what does that mean for us as consumers, and how we can impact the things that matter to us, whatever that means, whether it's American manufacturing or something else. How technology is unlocking the ability for us as consumers to begin to direct our dollars to things that matter to us. Thank you very much.